Hey everyone, and welcome to your C# tutorial on classes and objects. As you can see, I have Visual Studio pulled up here and the boilerplate code ready to go. So to begin this discussion on classes and objects, let's start off with the definition. So we can define a class as a code template for creating objects. The class defines the type. So let's also define an object, because it's a little bit easier to understand the relationship between these two things if we have a solid definition for each one. An object is a block of memory set aside and configured according to the class blueprint, right? So you can kind of think of a class as a set of instructions for creating objects, right? So if you wanted to build a house, for example, you would need a blueprint on how to make the house. And using that one blueprint, you could make many houses as you wanted, as long as you had the materials. So you can think of a class the same way. A class is sort of a blueprint that you can use. It's one blueprint that can create many objects. Okay, so let's create a new class. So we actually already have a class up here called program. And so this is just automatically generated by Visual Studio, which is the IDE that I'm using here. Visual Studio creates this automatically and loads in a main method where we run our program. We've kind of talked about this before. So normally, when you create a new class, you want to give it its own file. However, for the ease of instruction right now, I'm going to just create the class below our existing program class. So just as you can see with this class up here, this class starts with the keyword class, so that the computer knows that we're creating a class, and then we have a name after it, in the same way that we have a name for a variable. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the keyword class, and then we're going to give it the name. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a class that will represent a person. So using this one class, I'd like to create many people. So I am going to name our class person, and I'm going to do a opening and closed curly brace, which shows the scope for the instructions in our class. So I'm going to open it up there. And now the instructions part of a class is a little bit unique. A class can contain variables, functions, and other data structures. So you can put a lot of stuff in a class. For our person class, I think all people have a name and an age. So let's create variables to define our name and age. We'll start out with a string for our name, and we've seen this before. I'm going to end it with a semicolon, and we'll use an int for our age, and end that with a semicolon. Now, in order for these variables to be accessed outside of our class, we need to define them as public. And we'll get into what this means later, but right now, just know that you need to define these. You should define these explicitly as public. Okay, so now let's create a variable using our class. So to store our object, we need to first create a variable to contain a reference to our object. So let's just revisit variables really quick. Let's create a variable called bank account balance, and we'll set this equal to 150. Now, we've seen this before. A variable is just a space in memory. In the case of an integer, it's a space in memory where we store the value 150. It's pretty simple. We've talked about this before in previous tutorials. Now, an integer is a built-in type that C# gives us for free. So behind the scenes, C# has a class very similar to our person class here that defines the blueprint for an integer. So every time we create an integer type variable, we're creating an integer object. So the integer class is the blueprint that defines the integer type, and we create integer objects using that blueprint. Now, those are special built-in types for C#. They're value types. And that means that you can give the integer type a value. The class that we're creating is a little bit different, but it's created the same way. So the variable for it is created the same way. So we use our class name to reference the type in the same way that int is the type for integer, or for the class integer. So now we create a variable name in the same way that we create a variable name for our integer type. So in this case, I want to create a person that represents Dave. So we'll give the variable name Dave. And so this is where it gets a little bit different. In our integer variable, we set our integer equal to the value of 150. Well, our class, a person, isn't as simple as one single value. A person is the combination of a lot of different variables, and people are complex. So we can't just give one value for person. So what we do is we use the new keyword, and we reference our class again. We say person. We use opening, closing, parentheses, and end it with a semicolon. So what this is doing is when we use this new keyword, the new keyword is telling the computer, hey, we're going to need to set aside some memory. And when it sees our person class here, it says, okay, well, that memory is going to have to be enough to store a person object. And so this is the creation of the object that we talked about previously. So this is our class. It contains the blueprint for creating the object. This is the creation of the object. And we're storing a reference to this creation in our variable. And so in the next couple tutorials, we'll be talking about the difference between a value-based variable and a reference-based variable, right? So just to recap, a class is a code template for creating objects. The class defines the type. Oops, sorry, I'm going to create this to make this a little bit bigger. An object is a block of memory set aside and configured according to the class blueprint. Down here, we have our class. Our class is named person. This class defines the type person, right? And so we can use that type person as a type to create variables. These variables can store references to our objects. Awesome. So now if we go down and we start using the Dave variable, we will have access to age right here and name. So let's access name, which is our name down here, and we'll set it equal to David. We can also access our age variable and set that equal to, we'll say, 35. Okay, so now we have our Dave variable, and we're accessing our member variables inside of that instance. This is really powerful. And we can see that this one class can be used over and over again. So we create another person, we'll call them Simone, set them equal to a new person, set Simone dot name equal to Simone age equal to 38, and you can see that we have these two completed people. Now, as you noticed, both Simone and Dave had the name and age member variable. That's because in our person class, we have our name and age member variables here. So each person that gets created will have a name and an age. And we made those public so that you can access them through this person type. So this is the very basic sort of relationship between classes and objects, and how you write a class and instantiate an object. Remember, this is the syntax for creating a class, and this is the syntax for instantiating an object. So in the next few videos, we'll be getting a little bit more in-depth on some of these concepts. Thanks.